Member for Goldstein. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to support the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation Amendment Bill of 2018. And I know that the federal government's working with states and territories in this space, and that states mainly are the providers of social housing, as we know. But this is a $1 billion facility. The National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, NHFIC, was established on July 1 of 2018 as an independent corporate Commonwealth entity. NHFIC works in conjunction with the bond aggregator to provide cost-effective and longer-term finance for community housing providers. NHFIC was formed primarily to increase the availability of rental and mixed development affordable housing stock available in the market through community housing providers. Now, there are 4 main amendments to NHFIC Act commenced earlier this year. The current Act provides that the board of NHFIC must collectively have an appropriate balance of qualification, skills and experience in a relevant field, being banking and finance law, housing, infrastructure planning and finance, local government and public policy. The amendment includes a new requirement that at least one board member must have appropriate qualifications, skills or experience in social or affordable housing. This amendment is critically important as it acknowledges that specialist knowledge is required to successfully operate in a field that is outside the usual experience of bankers, of lawyers and property developers. The skill set required is significantly different and demands are greater for people who run not-for-profit community housing providers. Those with tenants who are financially disadvantaged and may also have special needs. The easy answer from property developers at times is to build affordable housing on low-cost land on the fringes of urban areas, which can be far from jobs and schools and medical facilities, public transport and shops. And this therefore compounds the problems faced by financially vulnerable people who need this housing. Board members with social and affordable housing experience know that increasing the distance from services creates problems of intergenerational unemployment and poor health and education outcomes. Our aim, of course, is to focus in and should be on infill development. That's what should be their aim. The creation of affordable housing is middle ring suburbs, and of course this will help to provide the most vulnerable members of our community with improved access to jobs and services, with the hope that over time they or their children may be lifted out of the poverty trap. We also need affordable housing of this type in rural and regional areas that have similar needs and people with similar needs. The bill also provides for the statutory review of the operation of the NHFIC Act to occur after the period of 2 years rather than 3. The bill also provides that NHFIC may now redraw amounts repaid by community housing providers to the Commonwealth Government. The bill does this by bringing forward planned annual appropriations and the creation of a special account for the purpose of the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator. The amendments, therefore, in practical terms, provide for the $1 billion to be reused and avoids the lapsing of any undrawn funds 3 years after the appropriation. So the provision of government funding for affordable housing through community housing providers, of course, is not new. Previously, state governments provided financial assistance and land releases to facilitate affordable housing. Victoria has a long history of providing affordable rental accommodation through community housing providers. Successful examples of those operating in the field for decades include Common Equity Housing Limited and South East Housing Cooperative. New South Wales has a more diverse history, with both owner-occupied and rental affordable housing having been provided over the years by a range of different organisations using a variety of different means. Star Bouquets and terminating building societies provided members with low-cost housing finance based on a regular ballot system. Housing cooperatives historically borrowed state funds supported by bond issues to provide low-cost finance for the first home buyer members. These housing co-ops also previously ran ballots for first home buyer members for the release of state-owned land at affordable prices. The funds available through NIFIC will be provided for rental affordable housing and mixed developments. However, there's also a capacity for community housing providers to enter into arrangements to support affordable mixed owner, occupier and rental housing, the combination. As members would be aware, the price of owner-occupied housing in the market is gradually decreasing. However, as the Australian Financial Review explained in its article of the 5th of September, and I quote, "The proportion of household income taken to meet mortgage repayments widened nationally to 32.2% in the second quarter, from 31.5% a year earlier, as the average loan burden to first home buyers, whose numbers increased in most states, rose from a year earlier." And further, New South Wales remained the worst state for housing affordability in the June quarter, with the proportion of household income needed to meet mortgage repayments rising to 38.1% from 36.5% in March and 38% a year earlier. In Victoria, the figure rose to 34.3% from 33.4% a year earlier. So, what are our options? Well, there are many models that attempt to address the problem of affordability for owner-occupiers. Low interest rates and stamp duty concessions for first home buyers can at times fuel higher housing prices. Rising interest rates increase mortgage stress and foreclosures. And so the question is, how is it possible to reduce the construction cost of affordable housing without reducing the value of existing housing? I'm aware that a number of community housing providers are working together with groups of potential owner-occupiers to project manage and build their own affordable strata title or community title projects. Community title is best described as horizontal strata title. The completed apartments or dwellings are then available at cost to the owner-occupiers who committed their funds, their time and skills to the project, and to the community housing provider who acquires a number of apartments or dwellings for affordable rental purposes. The funds may then potentially be borrowed through NIFIC, and at the completion of the project, NIFIC could be repaid, or alternatively, the funds may be used by the community housing provider to finance the next mixed development project, just a continuous build, and what we need is more affordable housing. So these discussions are currently happening also with the providers, the community housing providers, with banks to gauge their interest in working with the community housing providers to support these types of proposal. This proposed mixed development model focuses on affordable owner-occupier housing for people like police, teachers, healthcare and social welfare workers, low to medium income first home buyers and low to median income people over the age of 55 who have previously owned a home but are perhaps no longer owner-occupiers due to life experiences such as divorce or illness, unemployment or the death of a partner. While the number of older women who are no longer homeowners are a particular concern, older men are also included in this category. And the aim, of course, is to provide the owner-occupier housing for people who are currently priced out of the market and excludes people who have the income to purchase housing at market prices. The aim is not to reduce the price of existing housing, but to provide a limited amount of housing for people who are on the margins of the market who would not otherwise be able to afford to own their own home. So this really is a good opportunity. For those who meet the criteria, it will require time and work over a 2 to 3 year period. It's just one of the options out there, the mixed development proposal, and I look forward to seeing more of that as NIFIC moves on, Mr Deputy Speaker. But I want to briefly talk to the issue around the effects on housing of Labor's negative gearing, and we saw today where this could lead to a fall of housing construction of up to 42,000 dwellings over 5 years and 32,000 fewer jobs. And this, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, released in August this year, showed a 9% fall in new dwelling approvals over the previous 12 months. We know that the Labor's policy will not actually boost the supply of housing or jobs in the construction sector at all. And there is a forecast of 8,000 fewer houses and 34,000 fewer apartments in the first 5 years. And I look at this and we know that Labor is, through this, proposing to further reduce the attractiveness of investing in rental accommodation by abolishing the negative gearing, as we've heard. I don't know whether Labor quite understands that this will actually increase the number of investors who actually leave the housing market, thereby reducing the price of existing housing and decreasing the amount of housing stock available for rentals. Changes to negative gearing and the reduction of interest-only loans means that investors will pull out of the rental housing market, further reducing the stock of rental housing and driving up rents. And we remember, perhaps Labor should speak to Paul Keating when we look back at the 1985 Labor experiment with negative gearing, when the Hawke Labor government changed negative gearing laws in July of 1985, only to reinstate negative gearing laws shortly prior to the 1987 financial crash. So what happened? The availability of rental accommodation in Sydney and Perth plummeted as investors sold out of the market, vacancy rates dropped to approximately 1%, and the price of rental accommodation in those cities surged. So Australians in rental accommodation are vulnerable if their landlords sell their houses or apartments due to the increased principal or interest mortgage payments or the loss of negative gearing. And we know that there are restrictions in most states limiting the amount that rental increases year on year, but there's no price protection when the renter moves from one home to another. The increase in rental stock being dumped into the housing market at the time of falling house prices would further destabilise the housing market even further. And if the value of the house drops below the value of the mortgage, past experience and prudent lending practices indicated that the banks would foreclose on the property and potentially bankrupt the former homeowner who cannot pay the shortfall. I just want to finish on how important home and security is, Mr Deputy Speaker. Both for a lot of our migrants who've come to this country, the one thing that was an absolute priority was to own a home. And they saw that as they would go without in many other parts of their life because they came from a country where they perhaps lived on a landlord's property and never ever would have had the opportunity, as some of the Italians found, to actually ever own a home. So when they came to Australia and they saw this wonderful land of opportunity where they could get a job, be paid well for that job, save their money and use that, so often their priority was to put a roof over their family's head. And that was an absolute driver. And they saved, and they saved, and their abiding pride in being able to put a roof over their family's head and pay that off simply by working hard. They were committed to the laws and the opportunities that this country gave and give. And for so many of them, they were grateful to this country for the opportunity it gave them. But one of the most important parts of their security, and the security in older age, was access to having a roof over their head and having that home paid off. And that's the one thing that this NIFIC bill gives a further opportunity to Australians to actually have the opportunity to do exactly that, to own their own home and to have access to affordable housing. I also met some young people recently when I was speaking at the Cape Naturalist College graduation. And it was interesting, those young people talking about how they aspired perhaps to having a smaller home than their parents because they were determined to actually get into a position of owning that home earlier. And they also believed along the way that they wanted to be able to have a range of opportunities, but they saw home ownership as a critical part of their security. And when you get to later years, Mr Deputy Speaker, an important thing for all of us is to own the roof over our head. Then, irrespective of what health or other personal challenges that come before us, that we're in a position to manage those if we own the roof over our heads. It's a key part of our security, and I'm very pleased that the government is making further moves through the NIFIC Affordable Housing and Finance Investment Corporation.